They say a prenup is about protecting assets, but nobody tells you it can also be a weapon. I learned that truth on a Tuesday afternoon in August, sitting across from my future in-laws in their marble-floored living room, watching them slide a 47-page document across the coffee table with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm 32 years old, and I built a digital marketing agency from absolutely nothing into a company that generates over $3 million in annual revenue. I own a waterfront townhouse in Belltown worth $1.8 million. I have investment portfolios, retirement accounts, and the kind of financial independence I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks to achieve. And on that Tuesday afternoon, I discovered that the family I was about to marry into saw all of that as theirs for the taking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The document they presented wasn't a prenup. It was a hostage negotiation. $500,000 as an immediate payment to the Sullivan family for quote accepting me into their family. 40% of my business equity transferred to Derek, my fiancé, before the wedding. All marital property defaulting to the Sullivan family trust in the event of divorce. A non-compete clause that would effectively prevent me from working in my own industry if the marriage ended. And buried in Section 12, subsection 4, a clause that made me financially responsible for any debts Derek incurred during the marriage, including debts to his family. I sat there holding that document, feeling the weight of expensive paper stock in my hands, and I made a choice. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't beg them to see me as a person rather than a bank account. I would smile, I would nod, would tell them I needed time to review it with my attorney. And then I would show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 8 years building something from nothing while learning to spot predators from a mile away. Because here's what the Sullivan family didn't know. I'd been documenting their financial manipulation for 3 months. I had evidence of their failing construction business. I had proof they'd tried this exact scheme with Derek's previous girlfriend. I had witnesses, I had forensic accountants, and I had my own prenup already drafted, sitting in my lawyer's office, waiting for exactly this moment. My morning started like most Tuesdays. I woke at 6, went for my usual run along the waterfront, came home to shower and dress in the kind of casual professional attire that makes people take you seriously without trying too hard. Dark jeans, a silk blouse, leather jacket. My townhouse was quiet except for the sound of seagulls outside and the distant hum of traffic on Elliott Avenue. I made coffee in the French press I'd bought myself 3 years ago to celebrate my first $1 million revenue year, and I stood at my kitchen window looking out at Elliott Bay, watching the early morning ferries cross the gray water. I'd bought this place 4 years ago with money I'd saved and earned entirely on my own. No family loans, no co-signers, no help from anyone except the commercial loan officer who'd seen my business plan and decided I was worth the risk. The townhouse was mine in a way that felt sacred. Every piece of furniture I'd chosen. Every paint color I'd deliberated over. Every morning I woke up here, I felt the tangible proof that I'd made something of myself despite coming from a background that offered me exactly nothing in terms of financial advantage. My parents divorced when I was 7. My mother worked 2 jobs and still barely kept us in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tacoma. My father disappeared into alcoholism and we lost contact when I was 12. I put myself through University of Washington on scholarships and student loans that took me 6 years to pay off. I started my digital marketing agency in my studio apartment with a used laptop and clients I found through cold calling and relentless networking. Nobody handed me anything. Every dollar I had, I'd earned by being smarter, working harder, and refusing to accept that my background determined my future. Derek knew all of this. We'd met 2 years ago at a tech industry mixer in South Lake Union. He was a software architect at one of the big companies, well paid but not wealthy, and I'd been immediately drawn to how different he seemed from the usual tech bros who dominated those events. He asked about my business with genuine interest. He listened when I talked instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He seemed to respect that I'd built something real, something mine. We dated for a year before moving in together, and he proposed on a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands 6 months after that. It had felt natural, comfortable, right. His family was another story entirely. Barbara and Philip Sullivan lived on Mercer Island in a sprawling lakefront mansion that screamed old money and careful cultivation of image. The first time Derek took me to meet them, 8 months into our relationship, I knew within 15 minutes that they saw me as deficient. Barbara's eyes had traveled over my outfit, a perfectly nice dress I'd bought at Nordstrom, with the kind of dismissive assessment that communicated I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. Philip had asked about my business in a tone that suggested he was humoring a child playing pretend. And Derek's sister Cassandra had barely looked up from her phone during the entire dinner. But I'd told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't marrying his family. I was marrying Derek. And Derek, for all his family's obvious wealth and status consciousness, seemed genuinely different from them. He worked for his salary. He lived modestly despite presumably having access to family money. He claimed to respect my independence and my success. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could exist separate from the toxic dynamics of the family that raised him. The cracks started showing about 3 months ago, in early June, right after Derek and I got engaged. His parents insisted on hosting an engagement party at their Mercer Island estate, and while I'd initially declined, wanting something smaller and more intimate, Derek convinced me it would mean a lot to his mother. So I agreed. The party was exactly what I expected: 200 guests I'd never met, champagne towers and a live string quartet, women in designer dresses making small talk about vacation homes and charity galas. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, spent $400 on it, and still felt underdressed compared to the casual wealth on display around me. What I noticed that night, though I didn't fully process it until later, was how often Derek's parents brought up money. Barbara mentioned 3 separate times how expensive the party was, how much effort went into planning it, how lucky we were to have such generous parents willing to invest in celebrating our love. Philip cornered me near the dessert table and asked detailed questions about my business revenue, my client retention rates, my growth projections. At the time I thought he was just making conversation, showing interest in my work. Looking back, I realize he was conducting due diligence, calculating exactly how much I was worth and whether I was worth the investment of accepting me into the family. 2 weeks after the engagement party, Derek mentioned casually over dinner that his parents thought we should consider a prenup. Just to protect both of us, he said. Just to make sure everything was clear and fair going into the marriage. I didn't object to the idea. I actually thought it was reasonable. I had assets to protect. I'd built something valuable and I wanted to ensure that if things went wrong, my business and my property stayed mine. So I told Derek I thought it was a good idea, that I'd have my attorney draw something up, and we'd both review it together. His response surprised me. He said his parents had already spoken to their family attorney and had something drafted. He said it would be easier and faster to just review what they'd prepared. He said we could make changes if needed, but this would give us a starting point. Something in his tone felt off. A little too casual. A little too rehearsed. But I told myself I was being paranoid. These were going to be my in-laws. Derek's family. Surely they had our best interests at heart. The meeting was scheduled for August 3rd, a Tuesday afternoon. Derek and I drove to Mercer Island together, his hand on my knee as we crossed the I-90 bridge, the Seattle skyline shrinking behind us. The weather was typical Pacific Northwest summer, overcast and cool despite being early August, and I remember thinking the gray sky matched my growing sense of unease. Derek had been quieter than usual that morning. When I asked if he was nervous about reviewing the prenup, he said no, but his jaw was tight and he kept checking his phone. Barbara answered the door wearing cream-colored linen and pearls, her blonde hair styled in that expensive way that looks effortless but costs $300 to maintain. She hugged Derek warmly and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes before ushering us into the living room. Philip was already there, sitting in a leather chair that looked like a throne, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with boat shoes. The portrait of casual wealth. Cassandra was there too, perched on the arm of the sofa, looking uncomfortable. The living room was all marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Washington. Original art on the walls. Fresh flowers in crystal vases. Everything positioned to communicate success, taste, stability. I sat on the cream-colored sofa, Derek beside me, and Barbara poured sparkling water into crystal glasses while making small talk about the weather and weekend plans. The whole scene felt choreographed, rehearsed, and I felt my shoulders tensing. Then Philip cleared his throat and the pleasant small talk stopped. He reached for a leather folder on the coffee table and extracted a document, 47 pages bound with a black clip, and slid it across the polished surface toward me. "This is what our attorney prepared," he said. "We think it's fair and comprehensive. It protects everyone's interests." Derek shifted beside me but said nothing. I picked up the document and started reading. The first few pages were standard prenup language. Separate property defined. Marital property outlined. Provisions for spousal support in the event of dissolution. Nothing unusual or alarming. Then I reached page 7 and my stomach dropped. Section 3.2, Transfer of Business Equity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Upon marriage, Victoria Hayes agrees to transfer 40% equity in Hayes and Associates to Derek Sullivan as marital property, acknowledging that the support and partnership of marriage contributes to business success. I read that sentence 3 times, each time feeling my pulse quicken. They wanted me to give away 40% of the company I'd built from nothing. The company I'd worked 80-hour weeks to grow. The company that existed because of my vision, my clients, my reputation. They wanted Derek, who had contributed exactly nothing to my business, to own nearly half of it simply by virtue of marrying me. I kept reading. Section 4.1, Family Trust Provisions. All marital property including real estate, investments, and business assets shall be held in trust with the Sullivan Family Trust as beneficiary in the event of divorce or dissolution. Translation: if our marriage ended, everything I'd brought into it would default to his family's trust. Not to Derek. Not split between us. To his parents' family trust. Section 5.3 made my hands start shaking. Debt Responsibility Clause. Victoria Hayes agrees to assume equal responsibility for any debts incurred by Derek Sullivan during the marriage, including loans from family members or family business entities. They were trying to make me legally responsible for debts I had no knowledge of, no control over, debts Derek might incur to his own family. The non-compete clause in Section 12 was particularly brazen. In the event of dissolution, Victoria Hayes agrees not to engage in digital marketing services, social media management, or related business activities within Washington state for a period of 5 years. They wanted to ban me from working in my own industry, in my own state, if the marriage ended. It would effectively destroy my business, my career, everything I'd built. I would have to start over in a new field or move to a new state, while Derek walked away with 40% of my company and all our marital assets safely in his family's trust. I sat there holding this document, feeling the expensive paper stock in my hands, and understood with absolute clarity that this was never about protecting anyone's interests. This was a calculated plan to transfer my wealth to the Sullivan family. This was them seeing my success and deciding they deserved a piece of it. This was them treating me like a resource to be extracted rather than a person Derek supposedly loved. I looked up from the document to find all 3 of them watching me. Barbara with that same smile that didn't reach her eyes. Philip leaning back in his chair with casual confidence. Derek staring at his hands. I tested Derek first. I needed to know if he was in on this or if his parents had blindsided him too. "This seems pretty one-sided," I said carefully, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm transferring 40% of my business, but I don't see any corresponding transfer of assets from Derek." Derek finally looked at me and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Guilt mixed with defensiveness. "My parents think marriage is a partnership," he said. "Your business will benefit from my support." That told me everything I needed to know. He'd known. He'd agreed to this. He'd sat in whatever family meeting where they drafted this extraction plan and he'd said yes. I took a slow breath and set the document on the coffee table. "This is a lot to review," I said. "I'll need to go through it with my attorney before signing anything." Barbara's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, dear, but we were hoping to finalize this quickly. The wedding is only 6 weeks away and we have so many other details to handle. I smiled back at her, matching her pleasant tone with my own calculated sweetness. I understand, but 47 pages of legal language isn't something I can agree to without proper legal counsel. I'm sure you understand. Any good businesswoman would do the same. Philip spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected compliance. Victoria, this prenup is standard for families like ours. We've had our attorney review every clause. It's all perfectly fair and legal. You're welcome to have your attorney look at it, but I don't think you'll find anything objectionable. Families like ours. The phrase hung in the air, loaded with implications. Families with money. Families with status. Families who knew how things were done. And the unspoken message was clear: I wasn't from a family like theirs. I was an outsider who should be grateful to be accepted, grateful enough not to question or object or demand fairness. I stood up, smoothing my jeans, picking up the document. Thank you for having this prepared. I'll have my attorney review it this week and we can discuss any questions or modifications. I turned to Derek. Ready to go? He looked startled, like he'd expected me to sign it right there or at least sit through more pressure. Barbara's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment. You're not taking this seriously, she said, her voice sharper now. This is a legal agreement, Victoria. It requires consideration and respect. I met her eyes directly. I'm taking it very seriously, Barbara. That's exactly why I'm having my attorney review it before signing. Any legal agreement this comprehensive deserves that level of consideration and respect. The drive back to Seattle was silent for the first 10 minutes. Derek kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how to start. Finally, as we merged onto I-90, he spoke. You're mad. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I'm processing. They're trying to protect their assets, Victoria. That's all this is. I pulled into the right lane and exited onto Rainier Avenue, taking the long way back to give us time to talk. Derek, that prenup isn't about protecting assets. It's about taking mine. They want me to give you 40% of my company. They want all our marital property in their family trust. They want me banned from working in my own industry if we divorce. How is any of that protecting their assets? He was quiet for a moment. Maybe some of the language is aggressive, but that's just how lawyers write these things. You can negotiate. I pulled up to a red light and turned to look at him fully. Did you read it before today? His silence was answer enough. You knew what was in it. You agreed to it. Derek, I built that company from nothing. I worked for 8 years to get where I am. And your family wants me to hand over 40% of it because I'm marrying you? How is that fair? He shifted uncomfortably. My parents think marriage is a partnership. What you build after we're married, we build together. But I built it before we got engaged. I built it before I even met you. That company exists because of me, not because of us. The light turned green and I drove toward Belltown, my hands tight on the steering wheel. Derek tried a different approach. Look, I know the prenup seems harsh. But my family has been burned before. They've seen people marry for money. They're just being cautious. So they assume I'm marrying you for money. That's what you're saying. They assume I'm a gold digger who built a $3 million company as some kind of elaborate con to access the Sullivan family fortune? He didn't answer that. We pulled up to my townhouse and I parked but didn't get out. I need you to be honest with me right now, Derek. Do you think this prenup is fair? More silence. Then, quietly, I think you could negotiate some of the terms. That wasn't what I asked. I got out of the car and walked to my front door without waiting for him. Inside, I went straight to my home office and opened my laptop. Derek followed me, standing in the doorway. Victoria, please don't make this a huge thing. My family is just being careful. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd been refusing to see for months. The way he'd always deferred to his parents' opinions. The way he'd convinced me to have the engagement party I didn't want. The way he'd introduced me to his business contacts as his fiancée who runs a little marketing company, diminishing what I'd built. The way he'd never once stood up for me when his mother made subtle digs about my background or my clothes or my lack of family pedigree. "I need some space tonight," I said. "I think you should stay at your place." "Are you serious?" "Very serious. I have a 47-page document to review and a lot to think about. I'll call you tomorrow." He left, finally, and I heard his car pull away. Then I sat in the silence of my townhouse, the home I'd bought with my own money, and opened the file I'd been building for 3 months. Because the truth was, I'd started suspecting something was wrong long before that prenup appeared. And I'd been documenting everything. It started with a conversation I'd overheard in late May, about 2 weeks after Derek proposed. We'd gone to his parents' house for Sunday brunch, and I'd excused myself to use the restroom. The powder room was down a hallway off the kitchen, and as I washed my hands, I heard Philip and Barbara talking in the adjacent study. The door was cracked open and their voices carried clearly. "She's worth more than we thought," Philip was saying. "The business pulls in $3.2 million annually and the townhouse alone is worth nearly $2 million. Barbara's response chilled me. "Good. Derek needs someone who can help bail out the company. We're too far underwater to recover without a significant capital injection." Their company. Philip's construction business. I'd known he ran some kind of commercial construction operation, but Derek had always been vague about the details. He didn't want to work for the family business, he'd told me. He wanted to make his own way. Now I understood why. The business was failing. I stayed in that bathroom for another 5 minutes, listening. "We need to make sure the prenup is ironclad," Philip said. 40% equity transfer, debt liability clause, everything. If Derek does his part and she signs, we'll have access to enough capital to save everything. And if she balks? Barbara's voice was cold and calculating. Then we make it clear the wedding doesn't happen. Derek won't go against us. He never has. I'd flushed the toilet loudly and made noise leaving the bathroom, and when I returned to the dining room, they were both smiling at me like nothing had happened. That night I'd started a file on my laptop. I titled it Sullivan Family Documentation and began recording everything. Dates, conversations, observations. I started watching Philip's construction company more carefully. I looked up public records and found evidence of multiple liens against properties his company had worked on. I found court filings for unpaid contractor disputes. I found a pattern of financial trouble going back at least 3 years. The company was hemorrhaging money and Philip was scrambling to keep it afloat while maintaining the image of success and stability. I started documenting my interactions with Derek's family too. Every dinner where they mentioned how expensive things were, how much they'd spent on the engagement party, how lucky I was to be marrying into their family. Every subtle dig from Barbara about my clothes or my background or my lack of social connections. Every time Philip asked invasive questions about my business finances. I saved text messages. I took screenshots of emails. I kept meticulous records of everything. Because I'd learned something important building my business from nothing. Documentation is protection. Evidence is power. And if someone is trying to take advantage of you, you need proof. 3 weeks ago, I'd hired a forensic accountant. Dr. Patricia Morgan was a specialist in uncovering hidden debts and financial fraud, and I'd paid her $5,000 to do a deep investigation into the Sullivan family finances. What she found exceeded my worst suspicions. Philip's construction company was $2.8 million in debt. He'd taken out multiple loans against the Mercer Island property. He'd borrowed from business partners and failed to repay them. He was facing potential bankruptcy and the loss of everything he'd spent 40 years building. And buried in the forensic report was something even more disturbing. A pattern. Dr. Morgan had found evidence that Derek had been engaged once before, 5 years ago, to a woman named Diana Winters. The engagement had lasted 8 months before ending abruptly. Diana had been a successful real estate developer. She'd had significant assets. And according to court records Dr. Morgan had unearthed, Diana had filed a complaint against the Sullivan family for attempted fraud, claiming they'd tried to pressure her into signing a prenup that would have given them access to her business assets. The case had been settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement, but the pattern was clear. This wasn't the first time the Sullivan family had tried to extract wealth from a woman Derek was involved with. I'd paid an additional $3,000 for Dr. Morgan to track down Diana Winters. It took her a week, but she found her. Diana was now living in Portland, running her own development firm, and when I called her and explained why I was reaching out, she agreed to meet me. We'd met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland 2 weeks ago, and Diana had told me everything. The Sullivans had been charming at first, she'd explained, her hands wrapped around a latte. Barbara was so welcoming, Philip seemed genuinely interested in my work. But after Derek proposed, everything changed. They presented this prenup that was basically designed to make me financially responsible for their debts while giving them control over my assets. When I refused, they pressured Derek to pressure me. He told me if I really loved him, I'd trust his family. He told me I was being paranoid and selfish. "What made you finally walk away?" I'd asked. Diana had looked out the window at the rain. "I hired a forensic accountant. Found out Philip's company was in massive debt. Found out they'd tried this same scheme with another woman Derek had dated seriously before me. That woman had been smart enough to run before it got to the engagement stage. I realized I was being set up, that Derek was either complicit or so deep in denial he'd never stand up to them. So I called off the wedding and threatened to go public if they didn't back off. They settled, made me sign an NDA, and I got out. Best decision I ever made. She'd given me copies of everything she still had. The prenup they tried to make her sign. Documentation of Philip's debts. Email exchanges where Barbara had explicitly stated they needed Diana's money to save the family business. All of it dated 5 years ago, all of it showing the exact same pattern they were running on me now. Diana had wished me luck as we parted ways, and told me something I'd been repeating to myself ever since. "You seem smarter than I was. You started investigating before they could trap you. Use everything you found. Don't let them guilt you into giving up what you built. You don't owe them anything." Now, sitting in my home office on the evening of August 3rd, I had a file that was comprehensive and damning. 3 months of documentation. Financial forensics proving the Sullivan family's debt. Evidence of their pattern of targeting successful women. Recorded conversations where they discussed using me to bail out their failing business. Witness testimony from Diana Winters. And most importantly, I had my own prenup, drafted by my attorney Natalie Park 3 weeks ago, sitting in a secure file ready to be deployed. Because I'd learned something important in 8 years of building a business. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. When someone tries to take what you've built, protect it with everything you have. And when someone underestimates you, use that to your advantage. I opened my contacts and called Natalie. She answered on the second ring. "Victoria, hi. How did the meeting go?" They presented their prenup. "It's exactly as bad as we suspected. Equity transfer, debt liability, non-compete clause, everything." "Good," Natalie said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "That means we proceed with our plan. They've shown their hand. Now we show them ours." We talked strategy for 45 minutes. Natalie would send a formal response to the Sullivan family attorney on my behalf. We'd decline their prenup in its entirety. We'd present my prenup instead, the one Natalie had drafted specifically to protect everything I'd built while exposing every scheme they'd been running. And we'd schedule a meeting where I'd present not just legal documents, but evidence of everything I knew. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my living room window, looking out at the Seattle skyline lit up against the darkening sky. The Space Needle glowing white in the distance. Elliott Bay reflecting city lights. This view that I'd earned, that I'd worked for, that belonged to me and no one else. 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to see if Derek would choose truth and integrity over his family's manipulation. 6 weeks to find out if the man I'd agreed to marry was capable of standing up for what was right, or if he'd proven himself to be exactly what Diana's story suggested, a willing participant in his family's schemes, or at best, a weak man who would always choose his parents over his partner. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Can we talk tomorrow? I need to explain some things." I stared at that message for a long moment before responding. "Tomorrow afternoon. My place. We have a lot to discuss." Because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. They thought they could pressure me into signing away everything I'd built. They thought I was desperate enough for acceptance, lonely enough for family, naive enough about money to just hand over control of my life's work. They'd underestimated me completely. And they were about to learn exactly what happens when a woman who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing decides to fight back with every resource at her disposal. This wasn't just about protecting my assets anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of predatory behavior. This was about making sure no other woman fell into their trap. This was about showing Derek that love without respect isn't love at all. The prenup they'd given me was still sitting on my coffee table. 47 pages of carefully worded extraction. I picked it up and carried it to my office, placing it in a file folder labeled Sullivan Evidence. Then I opened my laptop and started typing. A detailed timeline of everything that had happened. Every conversation, every red flag, every piece of documentation I'd gathered. When I finally went to bed at midnight, I felt something I hadn't felt since that meeting on Mercer Island. I felt powerful. I felt clear. I felt ready. They'd made their move. Now it was my turn. Derek arrived at my townhouse the next afternoon at 2 o'clock, exactly when I'd told him to come. I watched him park from my living room window, saw him sit in his car for a full 3 minutes before getting out, and understood he was gathering courage for a conversation he knew wouldn't go well. I'd spent the morning preparing. Not emotionally preparing, I'd done that over 3 months of documentation and investigation. I'd spent the morning organizing documents into clear categories, printing relevant pages, arranging everything on my dining table like evidence at a trial. Because that's what this was going to be. Not a relationship conversation. A presentation of facts. When I opened the door, Derek looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. He was wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, unusual for him. Derek was always put together, always polished, always careful about appearances. Seeing him rumpled felt like looking at a mask slipping. "Hey," he said, his voice uncertain. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and he walked past me into the living room. He started to sit on the couch, but I gestured toward the dining table. "Let's sit here. I have some things I need to show you." The documents were spread across the table in organized stacks. Financial reports. Legal filings. Printed emails. Timeline documentation. Derek's eyes widened slightly when he saw the volume of paperwork. "What is all this?" "Research," I said, sitting down and gesturing for him to do the same. "Over the past 3 months, I've been investigating your family's financial situation. I hired a forensic accountant. I pulled public records. I tracked down your ex-fiancé. And I found out exactly what your parents are trying to do and why." His face went pale. "You talked to Diana?" "I did. She was very helpful. She told me about the prenup your family tried to make her sign 5 years ago. The one that would have made her responsible for your father's business debts while giving your parents control over her real estate assets. The one that's essentially identical to what they presented to me yesterday. She told me about the pressure campaign, about your father's company already being in financial trouble back then, about the other woman before her who got out before things went too far. Derek, your family has a pattern. They find successful women you get involved with and they try to extract their wealth." Derek's hands were shaking. He picked up one of the documents, a forensic analysis of Sullivan Construction's debt load, and stared at it without seeming to actually read. "You hired someone to investigate my family?" "I hired someone to protect myself. And it's a good thing I did because what I found is criminal. Your father's company is $2.8 million in debt. He's taken out loans against the family house. He's facing multiple lawsuits from contractors he hasn't paid. The company is maybe 6 months from bankruptcy. And that prenup they presented yesterday? It's designed to make me legally responsible for those debts while transferring control of my assets to your family trust. I slid another document across the table. This is the debt liability clause from your parents' prenup. Read section 5.3 carefully. Derek read it, his face getting paler. Then I showed him the equity transfer section, the family trust provision, the non-compete clause. I walked him through each element, explaining in clear terms what it would mean if I signed. You'd own 40% of my company despite contributing nothing to building it. Your parents would control all our marital property through their trust. I'd be liable for any debts you incurred, including loans from your family. And if our marriage ended, I'd be banned from working in my own industry in Washington state for 5 years, effectively destroying my career and my business while you and your parents walked away with everything. Derek was crying now, quiet tears running down his face. I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know about all the debt. I find that very hard to believe, I said, and my voice was harder than I'd intended. You grew up in that house. You've known your father's business your whole life. You were engaged to Diana 5 years ago when they tried the exact same scheme. Either you knew and you're complicit, or you've been willfully ignorant because it's easier than standing up to your parents. Either way, the result is the same. You brought me into a trap. He looked up at me with red eyes. I swear I didn't know the full extent of it. My parents told me the prenup was standard, that it protected both of us, that successful families always do this. They said Diana was paranoid and greedy, that she never really loved me, that she just wanted to take advantage of our family name. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. It's easier than accepting that my parents are capable of fraud. I slid one more document across the table. This is a recorded conversation from June 7th. I was at your parents' house for Sunday brunch. I went to use the bathroom and I heard your father and mother talking in the study. Listen to this. I pulled out my phone and played the audio file I'd recorded that day. Philip's voice came through clearly, talking about needing a capital injection to save the company, about making sure the prenup was ironclad, about using my assets to bail them out. Barbara's voice responding that if I refused, they'd make sure the wedding didn't happen, that Derek would never go against them. The recording was 90 seconds long and when it finished, Derek looked like he might be sick. They were planning this before I even proposed to you, he said quietly. They saw you as a resource, not as a person I loved. I have 3 months of documentation, I told him. Conversations they thought were private. Financial records showing the progression of your father's company collapse. Emails between your parents discussing strategy. I have witness testimony from Diana about their previous attempt. I have forensic accounting that proves every claim I'm making. This isn't speculation or paranoia, Derek. This is systematic fraud. Your parents targeted me because I'm successful and they're desperate. They used you as bait. And you either knew or you didn't care enough to question what they were doing. What are you going to do? He asked. Are you calling off the wedding? I stood up and walked to my kitchen, poured myself water, took a moment to steady myself. Part of me wanted to end this relationship immediately, to tell Derek to leave and never come back. But another part, the part that had genuinely loved this man and believed we were building something real, wanted to give him one chance to prove he was capable of growth. I came back to the table with my water. That depends entirely on you. I have my own prenup drafted. It protects my business completely, makes you solely responsible for any family debts you take on, and includes an infidelity clause and a family interference clause. If you want to marry me, you'll sign my prenup and you'll stand with me when I confront your parents with all of this evidence. You'll choose me over them, publicly and permanently. And if I don't? Then you're choosing to be complicit in their fraud. And I'll not only call off the wedding, I'll make sure Diana's story and my story both go public. I'll make sure every woman in Seattle knows what your family does. I'll make sure your parents face legal consequences for attempted fraud. And I'll make sure you're associated with all of it. Derek absorbed that. Can I see your prenup? I retrieved it from my office and handed him the 12-page document Natalie had drafted. It was everything the Sullivan prenup wasn't. Clear, fair, protective of what each of us brought to the marriage without trying to steal from the other. Derek read through it slowly. This leaves me with nothing if we divorce. This leaves you with exactly what you brought into the marriage, I corrected. Your savings, your retirement accounts, your personal property. What it doesn't give you is access to what I built before I met you. My company stays mine. My townhouse stays mine. My investments stay mine. That's fair, Derek. What your parents wanted wasn't fair. It was theft. He set down the prenup. What about my parents? What happens to them? That depends on whether they're willing to face reality. I'm scheduling a meeting with them, their attorney, my attorney, and a mediator. I'm presenting all my evidence. They can either acknowledge what they've done, commit to getting professional help for their financial situation without involving me, and accept that you and I set our own terms for our marriage. Or they can refuse, and I take everything I have to the authorities and let them face legal consequences. Derek was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, I need to think about this. I need time to process. You have 48 hours, I told him. After that, I'm moving forward with or without you. And Derek, if you tell your parents what I have, if you warn them so they can prepare or hide evidence, I'll know. I have ways of tracking that. And it will tell me everything I need to know about where your loyalties actually lie. He left without saying anything else. I watched him drive away and felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. I'd loved this man. I'd imagined a future with him. But I'd loved a version of him I thought existed, a man who was genuinely different from his family, who valued integrity and partnership and truth. I was about to find out if that man was real or if I'd been in love with a performance. The next 2 days were strange. Derek didn't call or text. I went to work, met with clients, ran my business like everything was normal. But underneath the professional facade, I was constantly aware of the clock ticking down. 48 hours to see if the man I'd planned to marry would choose growth or complicity. I spent the evenings organizing my evidence even more thoroughly, working with Natalie to prepare for multiple scenarios. If Derek chose to stand with me, we'd approach his parents together with clear boundaries and consequences. If he chose them over me, I'd end the relationship and proceed with legal action on my own. On the second evening, Natalie called with unexpected news. Victoria, I just got contacted by someone named Cassandra Sullivan. She says she's Derek's sister and she needs to talk to you urgently. She wouldn't tell me what it's about, but she seemed genuinely distressed. Should I give her your number? I thought about that. Cassandra had always been peripheral to my relationship with Derek. She was 29, 7 years younger than Derek, and worked in graphic design. At family gatherings she'd been quiet and uncomfortable, always on her phone, never really engaging. I'd assumed she was just antisocial or uninterested in family dynamics. Give her my number, I told Natalie. Let's see what she wants. Cassandra called 20 minutes later. Her voice was shaking. Victoria, I know we don't really know each other well, but I need to talk to you. Can we meet somewhere private? I suggested a coffee shop in Fremont, neutral territory, public enough to be safe but quiet enough to talk. We met the next morning. Cassandra looked terrible. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup, wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. She ordered a coffee with shaking hands and sat across from me in a corner booth. Thank you for meeting me, she said. I wasn't sure you would after everything. What's this about, Cassandra? She took a deep breath. Derek told me what you found. About the debt, about the prenup scheme, about Diana. He's been talking to me because he doesn't know what to do and I'm the only person in the family who might understand. Victoria, I need you to know that I've been trying to stop this for years. I knew what my parents tried to do to Diana. I knew about the debt. I've been watching them set up the same trap with you, and I've been terrified to speak up because they control everything in my life. My apartment, my car, my trust fund. If I go against them, I lose everything. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't watch them destroy another person. Diana got out, but she was so damaged by the experience. She had to leave Seattle, start over somewhere else, live in fear that they'd violate the NDA and come after her. And you're different. You're stronger than Diana was, you have resources and evidence, and I think you might actually be able to stop them. But I needed you to know that you're not alone in this. I have evidence too. Things I've been keeping for years because some part of me knew I'd eventually need to stand up to them. What kind of evidence? Cassandra pulled out her phone and started showing me screenshots. Emails between Barbara and Philip discussing their financial desperation going back 5 years. Text messages where they explicitly talked about targeting Derek's girlfriends. A recorded conversation from 2 years ago where Philip told Barbara they needed to make sure Derek's next relationship was with someone wealthy because they couldn't survive much longer without an injection of capital. Financial documents Cassandra had secretly copied from her father's office showing the true extent of the company's collapse. Why did you keep all this? I asked. She looked at me with eyes that held years of pain. Because they've been controlling my life since I was born. They decided what schools I'd attend, what career I'd pursue, who I'd date, where I'd live. Everything filtered through their need to maintain image and access to money. I kept the evidence because someday I knew I'd need leverage to escape. I thought I'd use it when I was older, when I'd built my own career and could support myself. But then I watched what they did to Diana and I realized if I waited until I was ready, more people would get hurt. So I'm giving you everything I have. Use it. Stop them. Over the next hour, Cassandra transferred every file she had to my secure cloud storage. The volume of evidence was staggering. She'd been documenting their behavior even more thoroughly than I had, going back years longer. She had proof of other schemes beyond the prenup traps. Small frauds, manipulated business deals, social climbing strategies that involved using and discarding people. Her documentation painted a picture of a family that had been morally bankrupt long before they became financially bankrupt. When we finished, I asked her the question that had been forming in my mind. Are you willing to testify to all this? Are you willing to stand with me when I confront them? Cassandra's hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady when she answered. Yes. I'm willing. They'll disown me. They'll cut off my trust fund and kick me out of my apartment. But I have some savings and I can couch surf with friends until I figure things out. I can't keep enabling them. I can't keep silent while they hurt people. You won't have to couch surf, I said. I have a guest room in my townhouse. You can stay with me while you get on your feet. We'll figure this out together. She started crying then, real sobs of relief and terror mixed together. Thank you. I've felt so alone in this for so long. Derek called that evening, exactly at the 48-hour mark I'd given him. His voice was rough like he'd been crying. I'll sign your prenup. I'll stand with you against my parents. I choose you. I need you to understand what that means, I told him. It means you show up to the confrontation meeting and you tell them directly that you support me, that you see what they've done, that you won't participate in their schemes anymore. It means you accept that our relationship with them might be permanently damaged or even severed. It means you build a life with me based on our values, not theirs. Can you actually do that? There was a long pause. Then he said something that surprised me. Cassandra called me this morning. She told me she's been documenting everything for years, that she gave you all her evidence, that she's moving out of her apartment to stay with you. She told me she's finally standing up to them after years of being controlled and manipulated. My little sister is braver than I've been my entire life. If she can do this, I can do this. I choose you. I choose us. I choose building something real instead of perpetuating their dysfunction. I felt something loosen in my chest, some tight knot of tension I'd been carrying. Okay. Then we move forward together. Natalie is scheduling the meeting for next week. Be ready. The days leading up to the confrontation were surreal. Derek moved some of his things into my townhouse, creating physical distance from his parents. Cassandra officially moved into my guest room with 2 suitcases and her laptop, everything else left behind in the apartment her parents controlled. The 3 of us spent evenings going through evidence, preparing for every possible response, strategizing how to handle the meeting. It felt like preparing for battle, which in a way it was. A battle for truth, for autonomy, for the right to build lives not controlled by Barbara and Philip's desperation and manipulation. Natalie scheduled the meeting for September 20th. Exactly what would have been our wedding date. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. We'd be gathering not to celebrate a marriage but to potentially end a family. The location was Natalie's law firm conference room, neutral territory with witnesses. Present would be me, Derek, Cassandra, Natalie as my attorney, the Sullivan family attorney, and Barbara and Philip. Also invited was Diana Winters, who'd agreed to attend via video call to provide her testimony about their previous scheme. And one more person I'd asked to be there, my Aunt Louise, who'd driven up from Portland to support me. Aunt Louise was my mother's sister and the only family member I'd stayed close with after my parents' divorce. She was 67, sharp as ever, a retired accountant who'd taught me the importance of financial literacy when I was young. When I called to tell her what was happening, she'd said she'd be there without hesitation. Your mother would be proud of you, she'd told me. Standing up to people trying to exploit you, that takes courage most people never find. The morning of September 20th arrived cold and rainy, typical Seattle autumn weather. I dressed carefully in a black suit, professional armor for what was coming. Derek wore a suit too, looking pale but determined. Cassandra had chosen a simple dress, her way of showing respect for the seriousness of what we were about to do. We arrived at Natalie's office at 9:30 for a 10 o'clock meeting. The conference room was set up with a long table, chairs arranged on opposite sides. Documents organized in folders at each place. A video screen ready for Diana's remote testimony. Aunt Louise was already there, sitting on our side of the table, and she gave me a firm hug when we walked in. "You've got this," she whispered. "You've done everything right." Barbara and Philip arrived at exactly 10 o'clock with their attorney, a stern-looking man named Howard Shen who specialized in family law. Barbara was dressed in an expensive suit, pearls at her throat, armor of her own. Philip wore a blazer and looked annoyed at being summoned to this meeting. They sat across from us and Barbara's eyes immediately went to Cassandra sitting on my side of the table. "What are you doing over there?" she asked sharply. Cassandra's voice was quiet but steady. "I'm sitting where I belong. With people who tell the truth." Natalie called the meeting to order before Barbara could respond. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss the prenuptial agreement presented to Ms. Hayes, the financial circumstances that led to that agreement, and the pattern of behavior that multiple witnesses are prepared to testify about. Ms. Hayes has compiled extensive documentation which we'll be presenting today. The goal is to reach a clear understanding and agreement about how to proceed. If we can't reach an agreement, Ms. Hayes is prepared to take legal action." Howard Shen, the Sullivan attorney, spoke up immediately. "My clients are here in good faith. The prenuptial agreement was a standard document designed to protect both parties. Any characterization of it as fraudulent or predatory is inflammatory and unfounded." Natalie smiled coldly. "Let's review the evidence before making claims about what's unfounded. Victoria, please begin." I stood and walked to the front of the room where I'd set up a presentation on the screen. I'd spent days preparing this, organizing 3 months of investigation into a clear narrative with supporting documentation for every claim. I began with the financial forensics. This is an analysis conducted by Dr. Patricia Morgan, a certified forensic accountant, showing the financial status of Sullivan Construction over the past 5 years. As you can see, the company has accumulated $2.8 million in debt. There are outstanding liens on properties, unpaid contractor invoices, and multiple lawsuits pending. The Mercer Island residence has 3 separate loans against it totaling $1.2 million. The company is approximately 6 months from bankruptcy. I watched Philip's face turn red as I spoke, but I continued without pause. This financial desperation provides clear motive for what happened next. I pulled up the prenup they presented to me. This document, presented to me on August 3rd, contains several provisions that would transfer my assets and wealth to the Sullivan family. Section 3.2 demands I transfer 40% equity in my company to Derek upon marriage. Section 4.1 places all marital property under Sullivan family trust control. Section 5.3 makes me liable for any debts Derek incurs, including loans from family members. And Section 12.4 prevents me from working in my industry in Washington state for 5 years if we divorce. These provisions, combined with the family's desperate financial situation, create a clear pattern. The goal was to access my assets to bail out Sullivan Construction. "This is outrageous," Philip burst out. "We were protecting our son's interests." Protecting his interests by bankrupting his future wife? I pulled up the next document. This is testimony from Diana Winters, Derek's former fiancée. Diana appeared on the video screen, professional and composed. She'd agreed to participate despite the risk of violating her NDA because, as she'd told me, some things are more important than legal agreements. Especially when those agreements were coerced. "Hello," Diana said from the screen. 5 years ago I was engaged to Derek Sullivan. During that engagement, Philip and Barbara Sullivan presented me with a prenuptial agreement nearly identical to what Victoria has shown you today. It demanded I transfer assets to family control and accept liability for their debts. When I refused and hired investigators who discovered their financial problems, they pressured Derek to end our relationship. To avoid public exposure, they paid me a settlement and made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. I'm violating that agreement today because I believe what they're doing is criminal and someone needs to stop them." Barbara had gone pale. Howard Chen was writing notes frantically. Philip looked like he wanted to storm out. But I wasn't finished. I have recorded conversations between Barbara and Philip Sullivan discussing their plan to use my assets to save their company. I played the audio from the June brunch, their voices clear as they discussed making the prenup ironclad, about needing capital injection, about ensuring I signed before realizing what was happening. When the recording ended, the room was silent except for rain hitting the windows. I have documentation of similar attempts with at least one other woman Derek dated seriously before Diana, though that woman left before things progressed to engagement. I have email exchanges between Barbara and Philip explicitly discussing targeting women with assets. And I have testimony from someone who's witnessed this pattern for years. Cassandra stood up, her voice stronger now. "I'm Derek and Cassandra Sullivan's daughter. For the past 6 years I've been documenting my parents' financial schemes because I was afraid of what they were becoming. I watched them try to trap Diana. I watched them calculate Victoria's net worth before encouraging Derek to propose. I have emails, text messages, and recorded conversations proving they've been planning this systematically. I'm providing all of that evidence to Victoria's legal team. And I want it on record that I do not support what they've done and I will testify against them in any legal proceeding." Barbara's composure finally cracked. Her perfectly maintained mask of wealthy sophistication dissolved and what emerged was something uglier, something desperate. "You ungrateful little brat," she said to Cassandra, her voice shaking with rage. "After everything we've given you, every opportunity, every advantage, this is how you repay us? By betraying your own family?" Cassandra met her mother's eyes without flinching. "You didn't give me opportunities. You gave me conditional acceptance based on whether I was useful to your schemes. That's not family. That's manipulation." Derek stood up then and I saw something in him I'd never seen before. A kind of quiet strength that came from finally choosing truth over comfort. "Mom, Dad, I've spent my whole life trying to please you. Trying to be the son you wanted, trying to maintain the image you needed, trying to ignore the ways you hurt people because it was easier than confronting reality. But I can't do that anymore. What you tried to do to Victoria, what you did to Diana, it's not just wrong. It's criminal. And I won't be part of it. I choose her. I choose honesty. I choose building a life based on integrity instead of fraud." Philip's face had gone from red to almost purple. His hands were clenched on the table, and when he spoke his voice was filled with contempt. You're choosing a woman you've known for 2 years over the family that raised you, that gave you everything, that built the life you've enjoyed? She's turned you against us with lies and manufactured evidence. This is a betrayal of everything we are. No, Dad, Derek said quietly. This is me finally seeing what we are. What you've been for a long time. And refusing to perpetuate it. Howard Shin cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with how the meeting was unfolding. Perhaps we should take a break and reconvene when emotions aren't running so high. There are legal implications to consider here, and I need to consult with my clients privately. Natalie shook her head. We're not taking a break until we establish terms. Victoria has presented irrefutable evidence of attempted fraud, systematic targeting of vulnerable parties, and a pattern of predatory behavior. The Sullivan family has 2 options. Option 1, they acknowledge what they've done, commit to seeking professional help for their financial situation through legitimate means, accept that Victoria and Derek will proceed with Victoria's prenuptial agreement that protects her assets completely, and agree to have no financial involvement in the marriage whatsoever. And option 2, Natalie continued, her voice hardening. Victoria takes all of this evidence to the district attorney. She files civil suits for attempted fraud. She makes Diana's testimony public despite the NDA because Diana is willing to face legal consequences to stop this pattern. She ensures that every detail of the Sullivan family's schemes becomes part of public record. And she proceeds with criminal complaints that could result in serious charges against both Barbara and Philip Sullivan. You have until the end of this meeting to decide which option you prefer. The silence that followed was profound. Philip was staring at the table, his jaw working like he was physically holding back words. Barbara had tears running down her face, carefully applied makeup starting to smudge. Howard Shen was reading through the documents Natalie had provided, his expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed the extent of evidence we'd compiled. Finally, Howard spoke directly to his clients. I need to speak with you both privately. Based on what I've seen here, you're facing potential criminal liability. The recorded conversations alone could support fraud charges. The pattern with multiple victims makes it worse. I strongly advise you to consider option 1. Philip stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is extortion. You're threatening us to get what you want. That's exactly what extortion is. I stood up too, meeting his anger with cold clarity. No, Philip. Extortion is what you tried to do to me. Extortion is presenting a prenup designed to steal my assets while your company drowns in debt you caused. What I'm offering is mercy. I could have gone straight to law enforcement. I could have made this public immediately. Instead, I'm giving you a chance to face reality, get help, and avoid criminal consequences. That's more than you deserve, and we both know it. Barbara spoke then, her voice small and broken in a way I'd never heard from her. We're losing everything. The business, the house, the life we built. We were desperate. We made terrible choices because we couldn't face losing our position, our reputation, everything we've worked 40 years to create. I understand desperation, I said, and I meant it. I built my business from nothing. I know what it's like to be afraid of losing what you've worked for. But I never tried to steal from someone else to save myself. I never manipulated someone who loved my family member. I never ran the same con multiple times on different victims. Desperation doesn't justify what you did. It doesn't excuse it. Aunt Louise spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years in accounting and had seen every financial scheme imaginable. Barbara, Philip, I don't know you well, but I know your type. I've watched wealthy people destroy themselves and everyone around them rather than face the reality that they overextended. Rather than downsize, rather than accept a more modest life, rather than live within their actual means. You could have sold the Mercer Island house years ago when the debt started piling up. You could have closed the construction company and let Philip retire. You could have lived comfortably on a smaller scale. But you chose image over integrity. You chose maintaining appearances over treating people ethically. And now you're facing the consequences. Howard Shen had been reading through documents while we talked, and when he looked up his expression was grave. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be very direct with you. The evidence here is substantial and damning. The recorded conversations show clear intent. The pattern with multiple victims demonstrates this wasn't an isolated mistake. If this goes to law enforcement, you're looking at potential fraud charges, conspiracy, possibly identity theft depending on how the prenup terms were structured. You could face significant fines and possibly prison time. Ms. Park's offer of option 1 is extraordinarily generous given what you've done. I strongly recommend you accept it. Barbara was crying harder now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Philip looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Cassandra was sitting very still beside me, her hand gripping mine under the table. Derek had tears on his face too, but he stayed standing, staying literally on my side of the room. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows, and somewhere in the building I could hear phones ringing and people going about normal business while in this room a family was disintegrating. What exactly does option 1 require? Philip finally asked. His voice had lost all its earlier bluster and what remained was exhaustion. Natalie pulled out a prepared document. You sign this agreement acknowledging the accuracy of the evidence presented here today. You commit to seeking legitimate financial counseling and restructuring for Sullivan Construction through proper bankruptcy proceedings if necessary. You agree that Victoria and Derek's marriage proceeds under Victoria's prenuptial agreement with no involvement from you whatsoever. You have no access to their finances, no input on their financial decisions, no attempts to borrow money or request loans. You accept that your relationship with Derek and Cassandra may be permanently altered by your actions, and you don't attempt to manipulate or guilt them into maintaining contact if they choose distance. Additionally, Natalie continued, you pay Diana Winters $200,000 as compensation for the harm you caused her 5 years ago. The NDA she signed under duress is void. You make no attempt to contact Victoria's business, her clients, or anyone in her professional network with negative information or attempts to damage her reputation. You participate in family therapy if Derek or Cassandra request it, but you accept their boundaries if they choose limited or no contact. And you agree that if you violate any of these terms, Victoria has the right to make all evidence public and pursue criminal charges without further warning. This agreement is binding and enforceable. Violation of any term constitutes breach and removes all protections it provides you. Philip looked at the document like it was a death sentence. You're asking us to admit we're criminals, to pay money we don't have, to accept being cut off from our children. How is that mercy? It's mercy because the alternative is criminal prosecution, I said. It's mercy because I'm giving you a path forward that doesn't involve prison. It's mercy because I'm offering you the chance to rebuild your lives honestly instead of destroying what's left of your reputation publicly. You don't have to like it. You just have to decide if you'd rather face a judge and jury. Howard Shen leaned in and had a whispered conversation with Barbara and Philip that lasted several minutes. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see the progression of emotions across their faces. Denial, anger, desperation, and finally something that might have been resignation. When Howard sat back, Philip's shoulders had slumped in defeat. We need 48 hours to secure the funds for Diana's payment and to consult with a bankruptcy attorney about the business. But we'll sign. We don't have a choice. You have a choice, Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. You've always had a choice. You chose greed over integrity. You chose image over honesty. You chose to hurt people rather than face your own failures. Don't act like we're forcing you into something. We're just finally holding you accountable for choices you already made. Barbara looked at her son and something in her face broke completely. I'm sorry, she whispered. Derek, Cassandra, I'm so sorry. We thought we were protecting our family. We thought if we could just get through this rough period, if we could save the business, everything would be okay. We convinced ourselves it wasn't really fraud because we intended to pay Victoria back eventually, to make everything right once the company recovered. But the company was never going to recover, Cassandra said. You've been throwing good money after bad for 5 years. You've been destroying relationships and hurting people to prop up something that was already dead. And you knew it. Deep down you knew it, but you couldn't admit it because that would mean admitting failure. It would mean admitting that Dad's business legacy was ending. It would mean accepting a different life than the one you'd planned. So instead you decided other people should pay for your mistakes. I watched this family tear itself apart and felt something complicated. Not quite sympathy because what they'd done was inexcusable. Not quite satisfaction because there was something painful about watching people face the consequences of their worst choices. Maybe it was simply recognition. Recognition that desperation makes people do terrible things. That pride and fear of losing status can corrupt basic decency. That families can become toxic systems where everyone plays roles that perpetuate harm. The Sullivans weren't monsters. They were people who'd made increasingly bad choices when faced with circumstances they couldn't control, and now those choices were catching up with them. Natalie printed out signature pages for the agreement. Philip signed first, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote his name. Then Barbara, tears still streaming down her face. Howard Chen witnessed both signatures and notarized the document. "It's done," he said quietly. "My clients have 48 hours to secure Diana's payment. The other terms are effective immediately. Victoria, I apologize on behalf of my firm for not identifying the problematic nature of the prenuptial agreement they initially presented. We should have caught the predatory provisions." I nodded at him but didn't respond. The apology was meaningless. His firm had drafted a document designed to commit fraud. That he was now claiming ignorance didn't absolve anyone. The meeting ended and Barbara and Philip left with Howard Chen, all three of them moving like people in shock. The conference room felt different after they were gone. Quieter. Sadder. Derek sat down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands. Cassandra sat beside him and they held each other, both crying. Aunt Louise came over to me and wrapped me in a hug. "You did good, sweetheart. You protected yourself and you gave them more grace than they deserved." "Did I though?" I asked quietly. "Give them grace? Or did I just avoid the harder choice of involving law enforcement?" Aunt Louise pulled back and looked at me seriously. "You gave them accountability with a path to redemption. That's more than most people in your position would offer. Whether they take that path or not is up to them now. You've done what you needed to do. Now you get to decide what comes next for you." What came next was complicated and painful and ultimately necessary. Derek and I postponed the wedding indefinitely. Not cancelled, just postponed until we could rebuild trust and establish what our relationship looked like separate from his family's influence. He moved fully into my townhouse and started individual therapy to process growing up in a family system built on image management and financial desperation. He had to grieve the parents he'd thought he had and accept the reality of who they actually were. Cassandra stayed in my guest room and threw herself into building independence she'd never had. She got a job at a small design agency that had nothing to do with her family connections. She started her own therapy. She began the slow work of figuring out who she was when she wasn't playing the role her parents had assigned her. Some nights I'd hear her crying in the guest room and I'd sit with her, not saying much, just being present while she processed years of manipulation and control she was only now allowing herself to acknowledge. The Sullivan family house on Mercer Island went into foreclosure proceedings. Philip filed for bankruptcy for Sullivan Construction and the business closed permanently. They moved to a small rental condo in Renton, a dramatic downgrade from their previous life but something they could actually afford on Philip's social security and what little savings they had left. Barbara got a part-time job at a boutique, the first time she'd worked in 30 years. The life they'd been so desperate to preserve ended anyway, just in a more controlled way than total public scandal would have created. Diana Winters received her $200,000 payment and called me personally to say thank you. Not just for the money, though that was significant. "Thank you for standing up to them," she said. "Thank you for doing what I didn't have the courage to do 5 years ago. Thank you for making sure they face consequences. You probably saved other women from going through what we went through." I told her I couldn't have done it without her testimony, without her willingness to risk violating the NDA. We agreed to stay in touch and she mentioned she might move back to Seattle now that the Sullivans no longer had power to intimidate her. Something about that felt like justice too. Diana reclaiming the city she'd loved before they drove her away. The months that followed were about rebuilding and deciding what I actually wanted. Derek and I went to couples therapy and had hard conversations about trust, about family loyalty, about what it meant to build a partnership when one person had been complicit in their family's attempt to exploit the other. Some days I thought we'd make it, that we could create something healthy from the wreckage. Other days I wasn't sure any foundation was strong enough to overcome what had happened. We took it slowly. No wedding date set. No pressure to decide immediately. Just day by day figuring out if we could build something real. My business continued to thrive. If anything, the whole experience made me more focused and driven. I hired 2 new employees to handle the growth we were experiencing. I pitched and won 3 major clients. I started a mentorship program for young women entrepreneurs, teaching them about contracts and negotiations and protecting themselves in business relationships. I wanted other women to have the knowledge and tools I'd had to learn the hard way. Aunt Louise stayed in Seattle, deciding she liked the city better than Portland. She found a condo near Pike Place Market and we started having weekly dinners. She became the family I'd always needed, someone who saw me clearly and supported me without conditions or expectations beyond basic decency. One evening in late November, 3 months after the confrontation, I was working late at my home office when Cassandra knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked. I waved her in and she sat in the chair across from my desk. "I've been thinking a lot about what family means," she said. "About blood versus choice. About the difference between people who are related to you and people who actually show up for you. And I wanted to say thank you. For letting me stay here when I had nowhere to go. For not treating me like I was responsible for what my parents did. For showing me what real support looks like." "You don't have to thank me," I said. "You stood up for what was right even though it cost you everything. That takes more courage than most people ever find." Cassandra smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "I got offered a full-time position at the design agency. It comes with benefits and enough salary that I can afford my own place. I'm going to start looking for an apartment next week." "That's wonderful," I told her, and meant it. "But you can stay here as long as you need to." "I know. But I think I need to prove to myself that I can make it on my own. That I can build a life that's entirely mine, with no safety net from family money or connections. I need to know I'm capable of that." I understood completely. That drive to prove independence, to know your success was yours alone, I'd lived that same need. "We'll help you apartment hunt," I said. "And you'll come to dinner every week, right? Because you're family now. Not the family you were born into. The family you chose and that chose you back." Cassandra's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that. I'd really like that." After she left I sat at my desk thinking about the past 6 months. How much had changed since that Tuesday in August when Barbara and Philip had slid their prenuptial agreement across the coffee table. How much I'd learned about myself, about what I was willing to fight for, about the difference between the family you're given and the family you create. Derek and I were still together but on different terms. Terms I'd set. Terms that prioritized my autonomy and my business and my right to build a life that wasn't controlled by his family's dysfunction. He was doing the work in therapy, confronting hard truths about how he'd been raised and what patterns he'd internalized. Some days I believed we'd make it. Other days I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty was okay. I didn't need to decide immediately. I just needed to keep building the life I wanted, with or without him in it. December arrived and with it the holiday season. I decided to host a dinner at my townhouse, something small and intimate with people who mattered. Aunt Louise, Natalie, who'd become a genuine friend beyond just my attorney, Cassandra, Derek, and a few close friends from my business network. Nothing fancy or performative. Just good food and honest conversation and people who actually wanted to be there. The night of the dinner I found myself thinking about Barbara and Philip's engagement party back in June. The champagne towers and designer dresses and 200 guests who were there for appearance sake. How much money they'd spent to impress people who didn't actually care about them. How empty all of it had been. My dinner party cost $400 for food and wine. We ate at my dining table that seated 8 comfortably. There were no hired caterers or string quartets or any attempt to prove anything to anyone. And it was perfect. It was real. At one point during the evening, Aunt Louise raised her glass and proposed a toast. To Victoria, she said, who taught all of us that the right response to people who try to take advantage is not anger or revenge, but boundaries and consequences. To building the life you want instead of accepting the life others try to force on you. Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and I felt something settle in my chest. Peace, maybe. Or just the satisfaction of knowing I'd faced a terrible situation and handled it with integrity. After everyone left and I was cleaning up, Derek stayed to help. We washed dishes in comfortable silence, and when we finished he turned to me. "I know we're still figuring things out," he said. "I know trust is rebuilt slowly and I have a lot of work to do. But I want you to know that standing up to my parents, choosing you over them, it was the first real decision I ever made. The first time I chose integrity over comfort. And I'm grateful you gave me the chance to make that choice. Even if we don't make it as a couple, I'm grateful you showed me who I could be instead of who I was becoming." "I don't know if we'll make it," I said honestly. "Some damage is hard to repair. But I appreciate that you're doing the work. I appreciate that you stood with me when it mattered. That counts for something." He nodded and left, and I stood in my quiet townhouse looking out at the Seattle skyline lit up in the darkness. The rain had stopped and stars were visible between clouds. I thought about the prenup still filed away in my office safe. The document that had started everything. 47 pages designed to steal what I'd built. I thought about my counter prenup, the one Derek had eventually signed, protecting everything I'd worked for while establishing clear boundaries. But more than the documents, I thought about what the whole experience had taught me. That love without respect isn't really love. That family can be toxic even when it looks perfect from outside. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is walk away from people who see you as a resource instead of a person. That building the life you want requires constant vigilance and the willingness to fight for your autonomy. That wealth and status don't make people ethical. That desperation reveals character. That the family you choose matters more than the family you're born into. I'd started this journey afraid I'd lose Derek if I stood up to his parents. Now I understood that if standing up for myself meant losing him, then he was never really mine to lose. He was a man still controlled by his family, still willing to sacrifice me for their benefit. The version of him that I could build a life with, if such a version existed, was the one who chose integrity over obligation. The one who stood with me against his parents. Whether that version could sustain itself, whether the work he was doing in therapy would create lasting change, remained to be seen. But I wasn't waiting around to find out. I was building my life with or without him. My phone buzzed with a text from Cassandra. "Thank you for tonight. For everything. This is what family should feel like." I smiled and texted back. "See you next week for apartment hunting. We're going to find you something perfect." Then I turned off my phone and went to bed in the townhouse I owned, in the life I'd built, surrounded by peace I'd fought for. The Sullivans had tried to trap me with a prenup designed to steal my future. Instead, I'd shown them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who knows her worth. Spring arrived in Seattle the way it always did, gradually and with false starts. A week of sunshine followed by rain, cherry blossoms blooming and then getting battered by unexpected storms. I'd always loved this season for its unpredictability, the way it refused to conform to anyone's expectations. March turned into April and I found myself marking time by the small milestones of rebuilding. Cassandra found an apartment in Capitol Hill, a one-bedroom with exposed brick that she could barely afford but loved immediately. Derek completed 6 months of therapy and started talking about accountability in ways that suggested he was actually internalizing the concepts rather than just performing understanding. My business hit a new revenue milestone in the first quarter, breaking $4 million for the first time. I hired a chief operating officer to help manage growth, a brilliant woman named Sonia Chen who had 15 years of experience scaling digital agencies. The day she accepted my offer, I took myself out for an expensive dinner alone, celebrating not just the business success but what it represented. I was building something sustainable, something that could grow beyond just me, something that proved the Sullivans' attempt to steal 40% of my company had failed completely. They'd wanted to claim ownership of my success. Instead, my success had expanded beyond anything they could have touched. But success in business didn't resolve the complicated question of Derek. We were still living together in my townhouse, still in couples therapy every week, still navigating the damage his family had done to our foundation. Some days felt almost normal. We'd make dinner together and talk about work and watch shows on the couch like any regular couple. Other days the weight of what had happened sat between us like a physical presence, impossible to ignore. The question I kept asking myself was whether forgiveness was possible, and more importantly, whether forgiveness was even what I wanted. Our therapist, Dr. Sarah Brennan, pushed us constantly to examine what we were working toward. In one session in early April, she posed a question that had been lurking under everything we discussed for months. "Victoria," she said, looking at me directly, "I notice you use very careful language when talking about your relationship with Derek. You say things like we're figuring it out or we're taking it day by day. But I never hear you say you want to marry him. I never hear you express desire for a future together. What I hear is someone going through motions of relationship repair without actually deciding if the relationship is worth repairing." The observation hit harder than I expected. Derek shifted uncomfortably beside me on the therapist's couch. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I know what I don't want. I don't want to marry into a family that sees me as a bank account. I don't want a partner who needs months of therapy to understand why it's wrong to participate in defrauding me. I don't want to spend my life wondering if he'll choose his parents over me the next time there's a conflict. But knowing what I don't want isn't the same as knowing what I do want." Dr. Brennan nodded. "That's honest. Derek, how do you respond to hearing that?" Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. "I think Victoria is right to be uncertain. I think if I were in her position, I wouldn't know if I wanted to stay either. What my parents tried to do, what I allowed them to try to do, that's not something you just get over. I want to believe I've changed, that I've done enough work to deserve another chance. But I also understand if the answer is that some damage is permanent." "Do you want to marry Victoria?" Dr. Brennan asked him directly. "If she said yes today, would you want to move forward with a wedding?" Derek looked at me and I saw something raw in his expression. "I want to marry the version of us that could exist if we both choose healing. But I don't know if that version is possible. I don't know if I've done enough damage that we can't get back to something healthy. I think about Diana sometimes, how my parents destroyed her trust so completely she had to leave the city. I don't want to be the person who does that to someone I love. So yes, I want to marry Victoria. But only if she genuinely wants to marry me, not if she's staying out of obligation or sunk cost or hope that I'll eventually become someone I'm not." The session ended without resolution because there wasn't resolution to be found. We were two people trying to build something from ruins and neither of us knew if the foundation was salvageable. On the drive home, Derek broke the silence. "I've been thinking about moving out. Not breaking up necessarily, but creating some space. I think we both need to figure out who we are separately before we can decide if we work together." The suggestion should have upset me, but instead I felt relief. "You're right. I think space would be good." He moved out 2 weeks later, taking his belongings to a studio apartment in Fremont. We agreed to keep seeing Dr. Brennan individually and to have dinner once a week, maintaining connection while allowing breathing room. The night he left, I stood in my townhouse that was suddenly just mine again and felt the complicated mixture of sadness and freedom. I'd thought I wanted to build a life with this man. Now I wasn't sure if I wanted to build a life with anyone, or if what I actually wanted was to keep building the life I already had, just myself and my work and my chosen family of people who didn't require therapy to treat me with basic respect. May brought an unexpected development. I received an email from a woman named Rachel Kim who identified herself as a journalist for Seattle Magazine. She was working on a story about financial fraud targeting successful women and had heard through sources that I might have relevant experience. Would I be willing to talk? My first instinct was to decline. I'd kept everything with the Sullivans relatively quiet, not public but not completely secret either. The people who needed to know knew. Making it a magazine story felt like crossing a line from justice into revenge, from protection into punishment. But then I thought about Diana, about the other woman before her, about how many more women might fall into similar traps with different families. I thought about Barbara and Philip's calculation that wealthy women could be targeted and exploited because no one would believe it or care. I thought about the power of speaking truth publicly instead of hiding abuse in private. I agreed to meet Rachel at a coffee shop in Ballard. She was in her 40s, sharp and professional, with the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on surface conversations. She laid out her research. She'd been investigating a pattern of wealthy families in the Seattle area using prenuptial agreements as financial weapons, specifically targeting women who'd built their own success. She had 3 confirmed cases already and suspected there were more. What happened with the Sullivans, she said, fits the exact pattern I'm documenting. Wealthy family facing hidden financial crisis. Adult child in a relationship with successful self-made woman. Prenuptial agreement designed to transfer assets rather than protect them. Pressure campaigns when the target starts questioning. You were smart enough to investigate before signing. But the pattern suggests many women aren't, or they're so invested in the relationship they talk themselves into accepting terms that destroy them financially. I listened as she outlined what she knew, which was considerable. Someone had talked to her, maybe Diana, maybe someone else who'd been targeted. Rachel had documentation of at least 5 families in the Seattle metro area running variations of this scheme. Not all of them were as blatant as what the Sullivans had tried with me, but the core structure was the same. Financial desperation hidden behind wealthy facades. Prenups written to exploit rather than protect. Women's assets targeted systematically. If I tell you my story, what happens to the Sullivans? I asked. Rachel was direct. They get named. Their attempt gets documented in detail. Other families running similar schemes get warned that people are paying attention. Women in vulnerable positions get educated about what to watch for. And maybe some of those women avoid the trap you escaped. That's the goal here. Not to destroy anyone, but to expose a pattern that's hurting people. I thought about the agreement I'd signed with Barbara and Philip, the one that restricted what I could say publicly. But that agreement had conditions. They had to maintain their end of the bargain. They had to pay Diana. They had to stay away from my business and my life. If they'd violated any of those terms, the agreement was void. Have they? I asked Rachel. Violated the agreement? Rachel pulled out a document. Philip Sullivan contacted 2 of your clients last month. Reached out through LinkedIn with messages suggesting your business was facing instability, that you were difficult to work with, that they might want to consider other agencies. Both clients forwarded me screenshots because they thought it was bizarre and unprofessional. One of them specifically said she nearly severed her contract with you before deciding to ask you directly what was going on. The fury that rose in me was cold and focused. He'd violated the agreement. He'd tried to damage my business after promising not to. Whatever restraint I'd been showing, whatever mercy I'd extended, he'd thrown it back in my face. Tell me what you need from me, I said to Rachel. I'll give you everything. We met 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. I provided Rachel with the full documentation I'd compiled, with personal details redacted but the pattern clearly visible. I gave her permission to use my story with my real name attached because I wanted other women to see that speaking up was possible. I connected her with Diana, who also agreed to go on record. Between us, we painted a comprehensive picture of how the Sullivan scheme had worked, how it had targeted multiple women, how it had nearly succeeded before I'd caught it. Rachel's article published in the June issue of Seattle magazine under the headline "The Prenup Trap: How Wealthy Seattle Families Target Successful Women." It was devastating in its thoroughness. She'd documented 5 families, the Sullivans featured prominently among them. She'd interviewed 8 women who'd been targeted, 3 of whom had signed exploitative agreements before realizing what they'd done. She'd consulted with family law attorneys who confirmed the agreements were designed to circumvent typical prenup protections. She'd even gotten comment from a forensic psychologist about the manipulation tactics used in these schemes. The response was immediate and intense. The article went viral on social media. Local news picked it up. National outlets started calling Rachel for follow-up interviews. Within a week, the story had spread beyond Seattle to become a national conversation about financial abuse in relationships, about prenups as weapons, about the targeting of successful women by desperate wealthy families. I started getting messages from women all over the country sharing their own stories. Some had escaped similar situations. Others hadn't been as fortunate. The volume of responses made clear this wasn't a Seattle problem. It was a pattern that existed anywhere wealth and desperation intersected. 3 days after the article published, I received a call from Howard Chen, the Sullivan family attorney. "Ms. Hayes, my clients are facing significant harassment as a result of the magazine article. They've received threatening messages, their address has been posted online, Barbara was accosted at her workplace. They're asking if there's any way to resolve this situation more quietly." I felt no sympathy. "Your clients violated the agreement by contacting my clients to damage my business reputation. That voided all protections the agreement provided. They chose to continue their schemes even after facing consequences. What's happening now is the result of their choices, not mine. But surely you can see this has gone beyond reasonable accountability. This is public shaming. This is destroying what's left of their lives." "They destroyed their own lives," I said. "They destroyed their business through mismanagement. They destroyed their family through manipulation. They destroyed their reputation through fraud. I documented what they did. A journalist verified it and published it. If they're experiencing consequences now, those are consequences they earned." Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You're right. I've represented this family for 10 years and I can't do it anymore. I'm withdrawing from their case. They need to face reality and they won't do that as long as someone is protecting them from themselves. Good luck, Ms. Hayes. You did what needed to be done." After he hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand feeling something complicated. Satisfaction, yes. Justice, certainly. But also a kind of sadness because this wasn't how I'd wanted any of this to unfold. I'd hoped the private agreement would be enough, that facing consequences quietly would change their behavior. Instead, they'd continued their patterns and forced public exposure. The magazine article brought unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship conference about protecting yourself in business relationships. A local law school asked me to guest lecture on recognizing financial manipulation. 3 different women's organizations reached out asking if I'd be willing to mentor young professionals about contracts and negotiations. I said yes to all of it because I realized my experience had value beyond just my own story. If I could help other women avoid similar traps, then something good could come from what had been a terrible situation. Derek called me the day after the article published. His voice was strained. "I just read it. I knew you were talking to a journalist, but I didn't realize how detailed it would be. How public. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Your parents violated the agreement by trying to sabotage my business. This is the consequence they were warned about." "I know." My dad admitted what he did. He said he was angry, that he felt humiliated by the private agreement, that he wanted to hurt you the way he felt you'd hurt him. He doesn't take responsibility for anything. He's still blaming you instead of looking at his own choices. Derek's voice broke slightly. "I'm so angry at them. And I'm ashamed I'm related to them. I'm ashamed it took me so long to see what they were." "Do you want to stay in contact with them?" I asked. "That's up to you, Derek. I'm not going to tell you how to handle your family relationships. But I need you to understand that they're not part of my life anymore. If you choose to maintain a relationship with them, that's separate from anything between us. I don't want to maintain a relationship with them. Not right now. Maybe not ever. I think the healthiest thing I can do is focus on building a life that isn't defined by their dysfunction. Dr. Brennan thinks I need to individuate fully before I can have any kind of healthy relationship with them, if that's even possible." We talked for another hour and by the end something had shifted. Derek sounded clearer, more grounded, more like someone who'd actually processed what had happened rather than just reacting to it. When we hung up, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt toward him in months. Hope. Not hope that we'd necessarily end up together, but hope that he was becoming someone capable of integrity regardless of whether that integrity included me. Cassandra's response to the article was different. She called me crying, her voice a mixture of relief and grief. "Thank you for not using my name. I know I gave you permission, but thank you for keeping me anonymous." The article says family member without identifying me specifically. "But Victoria, I've gotten messages from people who knew our family, who figured out I was the one who provided evidence. Some of them are supportive. Others are calling me a traitor. I'm getting threats. Come stay here," I said immediately. "Pack a bag and come to my townhouse right now. You're not dealing with this alone." She stayed with me for a week while the initial storm of attention died down. We spent evenings talking about the article, about the responses, about what it meant to be part of exposing a family that was still technically hers even if she'd rejected their values. She was grieving in a way Derek wasn't, grieving not just the loss of her parents but the loss of any fantasy that they might change, that they might apologize genuinely, that some version of healthy family relationship might be salvageable. One night she asked me something I'd been thinking about too. "Do you think we're the bad guys in this? We destroyed their lives. They're living in a tiny condo, dad's business is gone, mom's working retail, everyone knows what they tried to do. I know they deserved consequences, but sometimes I wonder if we went too far." I thought about that question seriously before answering. We held them accountable. We protected ourselves. We warned other potential victims. Those are all justified actions. What happened to them, the extent of their fall, that's proportional to what they did. They ran a systematic scheme to defraud multiple women. They destroyed Diana's sense of safety so completely she left the city. They tried to steal my business. And when given a chance to change quietly, they chose to violate the agreement and try to hurt me again. Everything that's happened to them is the natural consequence of their choices. But it still feels bad sometimes, Cassandra said. Like we're responsible for their suffering. You're not responsible for their suffering, I told her. You're responsible for telling the truth. They're responsible for the suffering that truth revealed. That's an important distinction. The article had one more unexpected consequence. I received an email from a lawyer representing a class action lawsuit against families using predatory prenuptial agreements. They'd been investigating for 2 years with limited success because victims were reluctant to come forward. Rachel's article had changed that. Suddenly they had dozens of women willing to testify. They were building a case that would target not just individual families but the attorneys who drafted these agreements, the financial advisors who helped hide assets, the entire ecosystem that enabled this kind of fraud. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve as a lead plaintiff. The lawsuit wouldn't just be about the Sullivans. It would be about establishing legal precedent that prenuptial agreements written with fraudulent intent could be challenged and that families using them could face civil liability. I talked to Natalie about it extensively. This isn't just about getting justice for yourself, she explained. This is about changing how these agreements are regulated, about creating legal standards that protect people. But it's also going to be exhausting. Depositions, court appearances, years of legal proceedings. You'd be putting yourself in a very public position. Are you prepared for that? I thought about all the messages I'd received from women after Rachel's article published. Women who'd been trapped in exploitative agreements. Women who'd lost businesses they'd built. Women who'd been so psychologically manipulated they thought the exploitation was their fault. Women who needed to see that fighting back was possible. I'm prepared, I told Natalie. Let's do it. The lawsuit was filed in August with 12 lead plaintiffs and over 40 families named as defendants. The Sullivans were among them. The legal theory was novel. Prenuptial agreements written with the specific intent to defraud one party constituted a form of financial elder abuse, or in cases like mine, constituted fraud and conspiracy. The attorneys who drafted these agreements knowing their predatory nature could be held liable. The families who used them could face both civil penalties and potentially criminal charges depending on what discovery revealed. The news coverage was extensive. We were framed as brave women standing up to systemic abuse, which felt both accurate and overwhelming. I did interviews explaining my experience, always careful to focus on the pattern rather than just individual revenge against the Sullivans. I wanted people to understand this wasn't about one family's desperation. It was about a culture that allowed wealthy people to treat successful women as resources to be extracted rather than partners to be respected. Derek sent me a text after the lawsuit was announced. "I support what you're doing. I know my parents will probably face criminal charges now. I think they should. What they did was criminal. Thank you for including that possibility when you gave them the initial agreement. Thank you for giving them a chance to avoid this. They chose not to take it. That's on them, not you." His support mattered more than I'd expected. For months I'd been questioning whether he was capable of truly separating from his family, of choosing integrity over loyalty. The lawsuit forced that question into sharp focus. He could stand with his parents and defend them, which would end any possibility of a future together. Or he could acknowledge what they'd done and accept the consequences, which might mean we had a chance. He chose acknowledgement. He gave a statement to investigators detailing what he'd witnessed, what he'd known, when he'd known it. He didn't minimize or excuse. He simply told the truth. And in telling the truth, he finally became someone I could imagine building a life with. But that didn't mean I was ready to jump back in. Space was still necessary. Healing was still ongoing. The lawsuit would take years to resolve and I needed to focus on that, on my business, on continuing to build the life I wanted regardless of whether Derek would be part of it. We kept having dinner once a week. We kept working with Dr. Brennan. But we also kept living separately, kept maintaining boundaries, kept treating our relationship as something that might work out rather than something that definitely would. By the time October arrived, 8 months had passed since Derek had moved out. The lawsuit was progressing through discovery. My business had grown to employ 15 people. Cassandra had gotten promoted at her design agency. Aunt Louise had joined the board of a local nonprofit. The life I'd built, the chosen family I'd created, it was thriving without needing the Sullivans or even needing Derek in any particular role beyond friend and potential partner. One evening in late October, Derek and I were having our weekly dinner at a restaurant on Capitol Hill when he said something that changed everything. "I don't think we should get married." I looked up from my menu, surprised. "What?" "I don't think we should get married," he repeated. "I think we should stay together, keep building what we have, keep working on trust and healing. But I think the idea of marriage is too loaded with the trauma of what my parents tried to do. Every time I imagine proposing again, I think about that prenup they made you sign. Every time I think about a wedding, I remember how they tried to use it to trap you. I don't want our relationship defined by that. I want us to be partners without the legal structure that they tried to weaponize." "What are you saying exactly?" I asked. "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want to build a life with you. I'm saying I think we're doing important work healing and growing and I don't want to stop. But I'm also saying I don't need marriage to commit to you. And I don't think you need it either. I think we've both learned that legal contracts don't create love and they don't ensure partnership. What creates those things is showing up every day and choosing each other and treating each other with respect. We can do that without a wedding." We sat with that idea over dinner, turning it over, examining it from different angles. The more we talked, the more it made sense. Marriage had been the tool his parents tried to use against me. Why give that institution power over our relationship when we could define partnership on our own terms? We could build a life together, buy property together if we wanted, make legal arrangements that protected us both without the structure of marriage. We could commit without conforming to the expectations that had nearly destroyed us. By the end of dinner, we'd decided. No wedding. No marriage. Just partnership built on choice and maintained through daily action. It felt revolutionary and right. The lawsuit continued through fall and into winter. Discovery revealed even more damaging information about the families named as defendants. Several had targeted multiple women over many years. Some had drafted prenuptial agreements so egregious that even their own attorneys had raised concerns that were ignored. The paper trail was extensive and damning. In December, 18 months after I'd first overheard that conversation in the Sullivan kitchen, the lawsuit reached a settlement phase. Most of the families agreed to settlements rather than face trial. The Sullivans were among them. They agreed to pay significant damages to both Diana and me, to participate in restorative justice programs, and to have their case used as precedent in family law education. Philip and Barbara would never face criminal charges because of the settlement terms, but their actions would be studied in law schools as examples of prenuptial fraud. Their legacy wouldn't be the successful business or the beautiful house or the image they tried so hard to maintain. Their legacy would be a cautionary tale. The settlement money, when it came through, was substantial. I donated half of it to organizations supporting women entrepreneurs and women escaping financial abuse. The other half I invested in expanding my business. Money they'd tried to steal from me would now fund helping other women build their own success. The symmetry felt exactly right. 2 years after everything began, I found myself standing in the conference room of my expanded office space, looking out at Elliott Bay on a clear September morning. The lawsuit had settled. The article had created lasting change in how predatory prenups were regulated. My business now employed 23 people and had opened a second office in Portland. Cassandra was thriving as art director at her agency. Derek and I had moved back in together 6 months ago, committed partners without the marriage certificate, building something honest and real. My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel Kim. The follow-up article she'd written about the lawsuit's impact had just won a National Journalism Award. Women across the country were using our case as precedent to challenge exploitative agreements. 3 states had passed new legislation specifically addressing prenuptial fraud. The pattern we'd exposed had created systemic change that would protect people I'd never meet. That felt like the truest form of justice. Aunt Louise was hosting Thanksgiving this year at her condo, and for the first time in my adult life I was looking forward to a holiday without dread or obligation. Just chosen family gathered around a table, genuine gratitude for genuine connection. Cassandra would be there, Derek, Natalie and her partner, Sonia from work, a handful of others who'd become family through choice rather than blood. No performance, no image management, no one keeping score of who contributed what. Just people who showed up for each other consistently. I'd learned something profound through this entire experience. The opposite of exploitation isn't just protection. It's building a life so grounded in your own worth that no one can convince you to compromise it. It's surrounding yourself with people who see your value without needing to extract it. It's understanding that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're self-respect. And it's recognizing that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you need, and that's perfectly okay. Barbara and Philip sent a card last month, forwarded through lawyers. It contained what might have been an apology, though it was couched in so much self-justification and victim language that it was hard to tell. They'd completed the restorative justice program as required by the settlement. They were in therapy. They were, according to the card, working on understanding what they'd done and why. I read it once and filed it away without responding. Maybe someday I'd be interested in their redemption arc. Today wasn't that day. Derek asked me recently if I had any regrets about how everything unfolded. If I wished I'd handled it differently, more privately, with less public exposure. I thought about it seriously before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that your parents chose fraud over honesty, that they hurt multiple women before someone finally stopped them. I regret the pain it caused you and Cassandra, the grief of losing the parents you thought you had. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret documenting everything. I don't regret letting Rachel tell the story. Because how many women are safer now because we spoke up? How many avoided the trap we escaped? That matters more than privacy or comfort. The Seattle skyline stretched before me through the conference room windows, the city I'd claimed as mine, the place where I'd built something real from nothing. My townhouse still felt like sanctuary. My business still felt like purpose. My chosen family still felt like home. And standing here, 2 years after that Tuesday afternoon when everything changed, I felt something I'd spent most of my life chasing. I felt enough. Not because anyone had finally seen me or validated me or given me permission to take up space. But because I'd learned to see myself clearly, to validate my own worth, to give myself permission to demand respect and walk away from anything less. The prenup they'd tried to trap me with was still filed in my office safe, a reminder of what I'd survived and what I'd learned. 47 pages designed to steal my future that instead taught me exactly how strong I was. Sometimes I pulled it out and reread it, marveling at the audacity, the calculation, the complete disregard for my humanity. And then I'd look around at the life I'd built, the business thriving, the family chosen, the partnership healthy, and I'd feel grateful. Not for what they'd tried to do, but for discovering my own capacity to fight back. They'd wanted my money, my business, my assets, everything I'd worked 8 years to build. What they got instead was accountability, consequences, and their scheme exposed so thoroughly that no one would fall for it again. That felt like winning in the way that actually mattered. Not revenge, just reality. Not destruction, just truth. If you're reading this, if you're in a relationship where someone is asking you to sign away your autonomy, if family is pressuring you to accept terms that feel wrong, if you're being told that love means financial sacrifice that only goes one direction, I want you to know something. Your instincts are right. Document everything. Hire professionals. Protect what you've built. And understand that people who truly love you will never ask you to make yourself smaller, poorer, or more vulnerable to prove that love. The family you choose matters more than the family you're given. The life you build matters more than the image you maintain. And your worth isn't determined by who accepts you. It's determined by whether you accept yourself enough to walk away from anyone who tries to diminish you. That Tuesday afternoon in August when I overheard them laughing about how dumb I was, I made a choice. I chose myself. Every day since then, I've made that same choice. And every day, it gets easier to recognize my own value without needing external validation. That's the real victory. Not that I stopped them, though I did. Not that I won, though I did that too. The real victory is that I finally understood what I'd always been worth, and I refused to accept anything less. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.